So it looks like people liked the piece last week regarding Titan Souls. Numbers don't lie. It had more hits than pretty much anything I've done on the channel before, and I can't ignore that. I admit, I like talking about games and promoting them more, but I can't ignore the fact that this is what people seemingly want more of. So it's time to cash it in and start writing nothing but hit and opinion pieces. Okay, that's not me. But when a topic comes up that I think I can intelligently talk about and gets me going in a sense, I will give it a shot more often from now on. But I do want to approach it from a scientist's point of view and look at both sides or multiple sides of an argument or a different argument entirely. I will make opinions in the end, but I will do my best to look at it as much as I can given the time frame that I have to work with, without any bias, objectively. Oh hey, would you look at that? The topic this week. That was completely unintentional and in no ways was a lead-in to the topic. Nope, not one bit. Objectivity has been a topic that has come up with the idea of ethics in journalism and is something that I've debated internally and externally a bunch over the last several weeks. The Merriam-Webster definition of objective is as follows: based on facts rather than feelings or opinions, not influenced by feelings. Now look, the thing about words is that they take a life of their own nowadays. It's not just enough to take a look at the definition anymore, with the current viral nature of media. Think about it. It's really dependent on your personal view or perspective of things. Take a look at a word, I don't know, feminism. This is where I duck and cover. Regardless of what the dictionary definition is, feminism means different things from one person to another nowadays. There's associations made with a word or phrase that may be true in some cases, but not in others. Feminism, Gamergate, Toucan Sam. Sometimes you get what it means, other times you have no clue. There's commonality in some of those opinions regarding the word, but that's the thing. It's not enough to take a look at the definition of the word in today's internet culture, even if the scientist in me would say that's the only place to go. But it is a good place to start. There's been a particular image that has circulated on Twitter and in other places that I picture here. Now, when I saw this, I did the same thing that I always do. Wonder what context it was in, and wonder why Twitter is still used in terms of a discussion ground. Again, like everything nowadays, it's really easy to take things out of context, misinterpret, or misrepresent something. So rather than going and researching everything, I just reached out to Jason, and he responded that very night and asked a question or two. He had indicated that he was thinking about writing an article about it at the time. And lo and behold, the next day, there was an article that he had written. I'd like to take the time and thank Jason for writing the article. It helped me in making this video and put my ideas on paper and helped me work and refine my opinion. I might have cursed him a little bit as I had to redo parts before that, but hey, that's refinement. For the sake of argument, let's take parts of it and break it down. Jason writes, your personal reaction to this tweet will likely depend on your personal definition of objectivity, especially with regard to how it applies to journalism. Ask 10 different people for a proper explanation of objectivity, and they'll give you 40 different answers. To one reader, objectivity might equate to fairness. To another, it might mean that a reporter must refuse to let their personal biases influence how they write or talk about a given subject. To others, being objective means keeping opinions out of reviewing and reporting. Considering I just talked about words meaning multiple things, I definitely agree with this. I was actually sort of taken aback because in my outline for this video, this is what I led with. So I personally blame Jason for taking my material. Please note he did not take any material in any way, shape, or form. This is a joke. Now the question here isn't what objectivity means for each person, and in particular in context of the topic of ethics in game journalism, does one follow a set of ethics that seem reasonable for a reporter to follow, regardless of what a word in a book means? Well, let's keep looking at what Jason has to say. He writes, so if not objectivity, then what? I think the two most important guiding principles for a journalist are honesty and fairness. Again, this seems reasonable. He goes deeper into each subject and in turn takes a look more closely at fairness, which is probably the harder of the two to tackle. Honesty seems more cut and dry with facts, but fairness does have a level of subjectiveness to it, but we'll get to that. If he would have said this, and this in particular at the time of the tweet, there probably wouldn't be as much outcry over it. Objectivity and fairness seem like they're very similar in a way to set up to describe, and one could use the word fairness to describe objectivity, and vice versa. He continues, fairness is a little bit trickier, because the act of determining what is fair is also subjective, and it can never take priority to the truth. It's certainly fair to ask all parties of a story for comment, and for any substantial or serious story, that's essential. But is it fair to give all those comments equal weight? He continues on later in the paragraph saying, should a journalist writing about a story about gay marriage give equal space to those who are against it? When I found out last year that the game company Crytek had not paid its staff, and the company refused to comment, should I have refused to report the story because we only had one side? Sometimes reality can paint an unfair picture. This is where things may get more dicey. Before I go further, I don't have a journalism degree. I have a degree in computer science, so keep that in mind with my understanding of journalism and what it means. Hell, I'm learning about this every day. But let's take a look at the portion deeper. Now, on the surface, he hits elements of journalism that I think is important. Diligently seek subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism or allegations of wrongdoing. That's from the SPJ Code of Ethics, which I think is a good resource in terms of journalistic integrity. So, good things on the surface. However, but his item on gay marriage is where things get a little bit more interesting. Take the SPJ Code of Ethics again. Support the open and civil exchange of views, even views they find repugnant. To me, I interpret this to be a cut and dry item, but it doesn't actually say anything about the information within that segment, just to support the exchange of views. One could think that the item in the Code of Ethics implies that it's equal space, but going by the letter of the law, that's not so clear. Even within these guidelines, there are things up for debate. Again, even with a set of laws, there are things up for debate, and the interpretation that we may currently have, it may not always be as clear. However, with my interpretation of it, it would be an equal attempt to understand and hear out both sides, and to translate their items into reasonable details within the article that would make sense to me. Not everyone is going to answer you. Not everyone is going to give you the level of detail that the other side has. There are multiple reasons for that. But like before, you do your best to get to that ideal. He continues later on. Because it is impossible to write anything without making those subjective decisions, it is impossible for any journalist to achieve any sort of objectivity, and it's silly to pretend that we can make those decisions in a vacuum. Writing can and never will be free of outside influences. It's too malleable. There is a truth to that. Pure objectivity is never truly obtainable. If it were, we would basically be non-human. We'd be robots who would take a series of inputs, sort them by a certain algorithm, and then present them back to the user. And let's face it, several people who are in the business got into it for their love of video games and what they mean to them, myself included. That alone shows that maybe we can't be the most objective in terms of information. But that isn't the issue I have here, and I can't believe I'm about to do this, but I'm going to bust out calculus to illustrate my point. Yes, you are about to have some math dropped on you. This is your trigger warning. If Greek letters or graphs give you problems, you probably should shut off the video now. You see, when dealing with integrals or limits in particular, we get the idea of infinity. The fact of the matter is we can never truly hit the number of infinity. That's why it exists. It takes the idea and puts it into a usable form. But the thing is you have to realize is that the concept of why infinity is important, and it's important in things like limits. When taking a look at a graph like this, one must realize that it goes on forever in the x direction, that it keeps going and going for the rest of the universe. But notice how it always stays under the value of 5. Notice how that as you go down the x-axis, you never reach the value in question. However, you get closer and closer as time goes on, and that's where I want to apply objectivity to the conversation. Objectivity is the function. As a reporter and as a critic, I want to go further and further down the line in order to get towards that limit, which would be, in my mind, a perfectly objective piece. My effort to that objectivity is on the x-axis, meaning with more effort, the closer I get. On one hand, I'll never get it, but on the other, I've come pretty damn close while doing it. You see, with me, it's about the journey and attempt to do that. And with Mr. Schreier's piece, and I hope I pronounced that right, I think that part of the journey is apparent with his reporting, despite what people may say otherwise. Some may disagree with me, and have indicated that he's backpedaling, but given my initial conversation with him, and him writing a piece that seemingly came from what I believe is from the heart, I believe in his more detailed explanation of what he believes. That's not to say I agree with everything he has to say about objectivity and what it means, but I thank him for responding with an article as I go into more detail right now. A quick note on game reviews. Obviously, the notion of a review uninfluenced by opinion is silly, and reviews are not very useful in a vacuum without influence from outside factors. But those who call for objective reviews while meaning reviews that are not affected by the pressure of video game publishers and developers, I sympathize. Your word choice could be better, but I'm with you. I do think there's some things that in that statement is missed in the idea of objectivity, at least in my definition of it, that I would like to address. One of the biggest points of contention, and I believe one of the biggest points of contention that those critical of sites like Polygon, Kotaku, and even TechRaptor have, is when the ideas of personal bias comes into game critiques. Now, Mr. Schreier indicates in his article that for those who are doing reviews that are affected by publishers and developers, that he gets the definition. Okay, that's reasonable. But that's where I think I start falling out of line with Mr. Schreier, as while I respect his opinion and his stance on the matter, I find that there are more steps that are needed to be taken into account. I think that there are other elements that he believes should be part of a good review process, but let's take what he said here and let's work off of that. Now, with reviews, it's an interesting dilemma. You're the one playing the game and experiencing it, and giving your experiences to your viewers and readers along the way. There's an inherent personality put into every review, and let's face it, when it comes to who you read or what you watch, part of it has everything to do with who is doing it. You need a bit of personality to stand out, to show that, yeah, you are human, and to also attract viewers. Some argue the idea of clickbait. Again, those nasty words with multiple meanings, but that's not what I'm talking about in terms of misleading titles. There's a reason why people watch Total Biscuit. There's a reason why people read Kotaku reviews specifically. It's all about the type of information that's presented and in what form, and what's most important to them. Do performance, a look deeply at game mechanics and throwing out all political elements out the window appeal to you? Then TB is probably your guy, especially for the PC. Well, really only for the PC. There is strength in an idea like this. If they are along the same lines of me in terms of thinking, then if they like the game, I probably will as well. But it's more than that, though, when it comes to an objective look at something in my mind. It's putting yourself into the shoes of other players, of other types of gamers, and attempting to understand if certain game mechanics, story, or experiences will work or not for those gamers. While you yourself may have issues with it from a personal level, it may not speak to you in terms of the type of gameplay. But in the end, does the gameplay itself do the job in terms of what it was attempting to do? Let's take a recent example from a video over on my channel. In Finding Teddy 2, one of the main elements that I had major problems with was the lack of information and guiding within the game. I kept getting lost and got frustrated with the fact that I had to run around looking for information to figure out what to do next. For me, the game was a failure. But that was for me. That didn't work. But when I stepped back and took a look at someone who loves exploration and someone who likes mystery and how they would view it, I saw a game that would appeal to them. A game where in essence you are a sleuth tracking down what to do next. In that case, the game had a very big strength. And so when talking about it, that's why I indicated it. It's a series I even made called Lock On to try to target an audience. You see, that's where I think people have problems with certain reviews, where they believe that a personal bias was introduced that didn't seem to make sense, or that the full experience of the game wasn't gotten. That for whatever reason, the game didn't get a fair shake in terms of coverage, due to some reason. There has been stories before about games being given to specific people who are not necessarily fans of the genre, and a game getting a lower score because of it. An infamous review regarding Fallout New Vegas comes to mind. Sometimes the reason is clear, other times not so much. And that's where I think the major factor lies in terms of where those who are really truly concerned about objective reviews have. Those who have talked to regarding it have with some of the current landscape of gaming journalism. While people may be reading your review, people use it as a buyer's guide in the end, and that alone may be a biggest problem there, as spending that hard-earned money on a review that left out something important rears its ugly head if you didn't like the game. Let's take an obvious example of what I'm talking about here, where objectivity needs to be taken into account. For me, this is an easy one, the Polygon Bayonetta 2 review. A huge deal is made about the sexual content that the game has. A game that is a sequel to a game that had obvious sexual themes and content. Now, the reviewer in question does detail exactly where he has the big problem with it, how he feels it's different from the first, so it seems like attention is paid to exactly what he's talking about. But while he had problems with it, to me, it showed him letting his personal feelings and bias influence the end score. He says it in himself. It put a big dent in the overall score of the game. How much is anyone's guess, and that's where somewhat the problem lies. For all the game does right, he talks about this more than anything else, and it's clear that in terms of disconnecting it from the rest of the game, he has a massive problem with it. So should a game suffer because of that? For what he took as pandering, I took a character that was confident. I looked at the facial expressions that went along with it. A lot of those shots had a character that was confident, in control, and willing to show who she was. To me, he let his personal feelings about the current state of women in society affect his review with personal bias rather than stepping back and considering how other mindsets would have taken it. And I'm not talking about people who would get off on this stuff. I'm talking about someone who's neutral on the subject or may even be somewhat put off, but not to the point of shutting off the game. Remember, this is a diverse community, and heck, it may open up opportunities in terms of looking at things in a different way. That's the subjective part of the review, and that's where people have major problems. The game itself seemed to succeed on every level, but when it comes down to it, one item in a pretty fantastic game drags it down to the point of being a pretty good game rather than an excellent must-buy game. That's a problem. But let's look at something that may be a bit harder to break down. Let's take a look at the Codename Steam review from Polygon as well. I'm sorry, Polygon, these are the ones that came to mind for me. The most problematic part that people point to was the fact that the reviewer, by self-admission in the review, didn't finish the game. Now, it's good that he put that information out there. At the time, he had reasons that on the surface are legitimate. The waiting out battle times against the computer, for example. There are times where you just don't want to play it anymore. But let's consider the fact that the reviewer never finished the end of the story, which in particular is an important part of gaming culture nowadays. A story-driven player may have put a lot of emphasis on how the story was executed in the end, and because the reviewer hasn't experienced it, does the review really obtain an objective review as a whole? That one part may be important to people, and as a reviewer, I believe you have to struggle through it. Now, I'm hypocritical somewhat. I do mostly first impressions on my YouTube channel. But if I'm presenting it as a review and as a buyer's guide to people, shouldn't that be part of it in the end? Currently, I'm grinding out the end of Karate Master 2 for a review on TechRaptor, and I'm struggling through it. But does that mean I give up? Not in my mind. Now, I give him credit for going back and changing the score after they patched the game. Except for one itsy-bitsy problem. One that should have been apparent to the editors of Polygon at the time, and that's that nasty word that's going around the industry. Metacritic. Because while that score was updated, the Metacritic one was not. They only take the first score, and Polygon realizes this with their provisional review system. Obviously, they couldn't have taken the idea of the patch into account at the original publishing time, but now that score looms over at Metacritic, not only dragging down the score as a whole, but it's not indicative of what the final opinion of the reviewer was. Now, how much of the score would have been influenced by grinding it out beforehand is debatable. The change in the patch is indicated as a good reason for the score change, but it's hard to say exactly what would have delivered in terms of the ending. I mean, it is the final punch, right? The climax? So the game's score suffers because of it. And Metacritic, I think, is one of the biggest issues in this. And I'm saying that with the idea that TechRaptor is applying for Metacritic status. Sorry, Rutledge. The problem with reviews nowadays is that they are expected to be on the same level with each other, and that's for a variety of factors. Part of this is Metacritic, which attempts to make an overall meta score to a game based on reviews. And that is unfortunately a major problem, as with the current state of review scores, you're not comparing apples to oranges. If the guidelines for these reviews were the same as everything else, then that could be possible, but that's not the case. I mean, it's different for each site. Polygon looks at things differently from GameSpot, which looks at things differently from TechRaptor. Even within an organization, a set of guidelines only goes so far, and that's always going to be specific experiences and information perception that will come into account. While it's hard to take the whole industry in mind when making your own review and product, it is something that unfortunately looms overhead. And then unfortunately that makes people question it. When you see user scores that are completely different than the Metacritic and review scores from professional game sites, it makes you wonder, it makes you question, and it gives them a feeling of unease. Now, for those who think objectivity is easy, on the contrary, it's very difficult, especially when you are so connected to your material. Now, I know this from personal experience. I try to be objective with everything I do, but even I recognize that I may not be the most objective a person at times. I take a look at my Resident Evil Revelations 2 review. The TechRaptor staff can tell you how much I hated playing through that game. Now, note, I did my best to be objective, to take a step back, and even though I was expecting a game that wasn't so focused on co-op, wasn't so focused on action, that I needed to take a look at whether a person that liked action would like it, whether a person who had a friend and wanted to play co-op would like it. Now, I found problems within those elements. That's the thing. Even when stepping back, I still found problems. And that's where I felt that, yeah, I'm being as objective as possible. But if I didn't take that step back, it would have probably even gotten a worse score, because it would have personally been all about me, the way I wanted to play the game, and what I was expecting. And I think that's where people have major problems. When personal opinions become a buyer's guide, that can be crazy. I mean, you may not know the person. You may not know exactly what they were feeling, what kind of emotions they had, whether or not they had a bad breakup, whether or not they had, something happen in the family that could have affected the score in the end. But beyond this, you see, this is now where a bleeding effect can happen. Trust is a hard thing to gain and an easy thing to lose. True trust takes time and effort to build, just because at times we can feel vulnerable as humans. We don't want people taking advantage of us. I know, I'm going back to the control issues that I talked about in the first video, but if you start to not trust one section of coverage, you start questioning the rest of what's connected to it as well. It's like blood dripping down the leg. It leaves a trail all over the place, in which people now are concerned about what's happening. Where did the blood come from? Who shot who? Did he stab him? And the internet, well, they're sharks. They will find everything and anything to show where that blood came from, and then they'll look at past scars and wounds to see if there's a pattern. When people see opinions about news and games that they now look at with a more skeptical eye, and their skepticism is dismissed as paranoia or not existing, then people really get riled up. When they present information that they think is relevant and are called names or grouped with people they don't identify, then all of a sudden, there's massive mistrust. But how do you deal with that, though? You set standards, and that's what it comes down to. Now look, just like the SPJ Code of Ethics, there's no set of standards or objectivity definitions that will handle every situation. It's impossible, and one just has to take a look at a current state of the laws to show that. Take fair use, for example, and the idea of Let's Plays. It hasn't been challenged regarding the legality of them, whether or not a Let's Play like Game Grumps or Markiplier is transformative or work enough to fall under the law. But the law does at least set a starting point of where to begin, and that gives people reference to at least understand where it comes from. Just like the Supreme Court, those decisions made are all based on not having a true description of current laws to deal with. And when appropriate, laws get changed based on what information is there or has come to light. But at least people have something to point to and say, yes, that is our policy on it. Yes, that is how we handle publishers in terms of reviews. Yes, that's what we mean objectivity means. Yes, this is what we think fairness means. Now, in information provided by Jason in that article, for example, it gives a glimpse on how he feels about it, and that serves as a purpose to judge his work in particular going forward. People grow based on experiences. The guys who are doing the newer ethics policy that's being worked on over at TechRaptor, they have a hard job to do. Let's not get that wrong. But we've used the experiences that have happened, refined them, and are going forward with it as people look at it more and more and more. And if that doesn't exist, where this question occurs regarding subjectivity and objectivity is, you're always going to have people who are really upset. Those who don't know what's going on and are afraid that they're being led by the nose or being misled by somebody with an agenda or not getting the full story. Why do you think that's a theme that seemingly exists in so many games over the life of video games? The Shinra Corporation controlling their own media and pushing down the message that, hey, everything's cool, you can totally trust them. They're not going to, do anything against you, right? They don't have their own purposes. The Battle of the Assassins and Templars in Assassin's Creed is another fine example. Hell, maybe gaming has made us even more paranoid with some of its better works regarding thinking that we are being lied to. But there's the kicker. You know those are games and not true because of a couple of reasons. One being the fact that you've got your hands on a controller or keyboard, of course, and that in essence is a rule. A rule of the world that is created. You're experiencing it via a different medium. So you can throw out the idea that it's truly happening. But the themes travel over to real life. Now, it may become a little bit more problematic with the introduction of virtual reality and devices that give us tactical feedback, but again, in that essence, you're evolving a set of rules. And it's rules like that can be applied to an ethics guide. So when people really truly have issues with things and don't think you're being objective enough, you can point to that and say, that's where we stand. Otherwise, it always leaves questions to be asked. There's regardless of who is saying it and who they may be associated with in terms of a group or a set of people, there may be a hint of truth to it, at least in their eyes. You may think you're fighting the good fight, that you're ethically sound and are trying to do what's best for the consumer, but the consumer doesn't necessarily know that and has no reason to believe it necessarily. And like other biases, maybe your ideals along the way have been swayed, where you aren't necessarily seeing the whole picture in the same way anymore. Not because you don't have the same beliefs, but maybe it's been changed a little bit over time. Of course, you'll always have people questioning you regardless of the situation. There's levels of mistrust, those who have been burned, so changed by their experiences that you'll never truly satisfy them. But for the majority of the audience, they can rest easier knowing that at least they have a set of guides that at least they can look at and question. Now, of course, those guides have to have consequences if broken, but it again gives them something to hold on to, a starting point of where you stand and how you stand. And I think that's what, in essence, some people regarding the Gamergate movement have in terms of ethics and games journalism questions. Now, not everyone has those questions, that's for sure, but there are concerns. Remember, some of these were gamers that were brought up in a world where video games were used as a fighting ground for fear-mongering. Heck, you could say that about this today. Violent video games will change your kids forever and become violent felons. You'll become sexist when playing this game. That they will rot the minds of kids. Now, could those be influences? Yes, of course, but it's been proven at times that it doesn't to the extent of being the primary cause. There are more important factors and other factors that play into it. You see, that's the thing. Gamers felt like they've been lied to and really have a problem at grasping in something in which they can hold on to. They need a safety blanket, as it were, to say, yes, I have this. I can hopefully believe in this, that these are the rules in which I can judge the situation with. Now look, the blanket could be taken away or torn. They'll be scared again at that point, but you do your best to patch it with new rules or understand what exactly went wrong and get the safety blanket back to those people. And with the idea of objectivity and what it means, well, I want to take a look at what Jason wrote. You see, when I look at what he wrote now, I have a set of rules in order to go forward, to judge him based on what he is writing forward. If this is what he truly believes and what he believes is going to be good for the gaming industry, I can now use that as a reference to his work. But let's take a look at the flip side. He presented that, but his colleagues may not feel the same way. And again, it comes down to this. What truly do they believe in terms of what bias and or opinion has on what they say in the end? And without a set of rules, it's just open for debate, and anybody can say anything.